Power has a way of revealing who people truly are. When someone believes they control everything around them, they often forget that some things cannot be bought, threatened, or commanded. Sometimes, the most ordinary person in the room holds the key to extraordinary consequences. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? What occurs when someone accustomed to getting their way encounters someone who simply won't move? In the corridors of power, where deals are made in whispers and fortunes change with a single word, one sentence can alter the course of history. One moment of defiance can topple empires. One guard, standing at his post, can remind the most powerful people in the world that some things are more important than power itself. This is the story of that moment. This is the story of what happened when President Marcus Wheeler ordered security to remove Captain James Rothwell of the Royal Guard, and how 3 words changed everything that followed. Some lines should never be crossed. Some people should never be underestimated. And some sentences, once spoken, can never be taken back. The morning air was crisp in the capital city of Valdonia as Captain James Rothwell adjusted his ceremonial sword and took his position outside the Palace of Nations. The gleaming white building housed the most important diplomatic meetings in the world, and today would be no different. At least, that's what everyone thought. Captain Rothwell had served in the Royal Guard for 15 years. He had protected kings, queens, prime ministers, and presidents. He had stood through ceremonies that lasted 12 hours without moving a muscle. He had faced down assassins, protesters, and drunk diplomats with equal composure. Nothing surprised him anymore, or so he believed. The Royal Guard was an ancient institution, dating back over 3 centuries. They were not just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms. They were highly trained soldiers, sworn to protect not just individuals, but the very principles of diplomatic immunity and international law that kept the world from descending into chaos. Their oath was sacred, their duty absolute. President Marcus Wheeler of the United Federation was scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock for a crucial meeting with King Edmund of Valdonia. The meeting was supposed to discuss trade agreements, but everyone knew the real topic was the growing tensions in the Eastern Territories. Wheeler's aggressive foreign policy had made him many enemies, and some allies were beginning to question their support. Wheeler was not a man accustomed to being told no. He had built his fortune in real estate, then moved into politics with the same ruthless determination that had made him billions. He believed that everything and everyone had a price, and he had the resources to pay it. Those who couldn't be bought could usually be intimidated or outmaneuvered. In his 5 years as president, he had rarely encountered a situation he couldn't control. Captain Rothwell watched as the presidential convoy approached. 3 black armored vehicles, followed by 2 security cars filled with Wheeler's personal protection team. The man himself sat in the middle vehicle, no doubt already planning how to dominate the conversation with King Edmund. The convoy stopped at the main entrance of the palace. Security teams quickly exited and formed a protective corridor. President Wheeler emerged from his vehicle, straightening his expensive suit and checking his gold watch. He was a large man, both in height and presence, with silver hair that he kept perfectly styled and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they saw. Wheeler's chief of staff, Patricia Vance, walked beside him as they approached the entrance. She was a thin woman with sharp features and an even sharper mind. She had been with Wheeler for over a decade, helping him navigate political waters that would have drowned lesser politicians. She whispered something in his ear as they walked, and Wheeler nodded curtly. "Mr. President," Captain Rothwell said with a slight bow as Wheeler approached. "Welcome to the Palace of Nations. I am Captain Rothwell of the Royal Guard." Wheeler barely glanced at him. "Yeah, thanks. Let's get this moving. I have a tight schedule." Captain Rothwell maintained his professional demeanor. "Of course, sir. However, I must inform you that there will be a brief delay. King Edmund is currently in an emergency session with his Security Council regarding developments in the Eastern Territories. He sends his apologies and asks for your patience." Wheeler's face darkened immediately. "A delay? How long?" "Approximately 30 minutes, sir. There is a comfortable waiting area prepared for you inside." Wheeler's jaw tightened. He was not a patient man, and delays were something he particularly despised. In his business dealings, he had learned that making people wait was a power play, and he did not appreciate being on the receiving end of one. 30 minutes? Wheeler's voice rose slightly. "Do you know who I am? I'm the president of the United Federation. Kings don't keep me waiting." Captain Rothwell remained calm. "I understand your frustration, sir. King Edmund is aware of your status and deeply regrets the inconvenience. The matter requiring his immediate attention is quite urgent. Patricia Vance stepped closer to Wheeler and whispered something in his ear. Whatever she said seemed to agitate him further. Wheeler looked around, noticing the media crews that had gathered to cover the meeting. He clearly did not want to appear weak or disrespected in front of the cameras. "This is unacceptable," Wheeler declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I didn't fly halfway around the world to be kept waiting like some junior diplomat." Captain Rothwell could see the president's security detail becoming tense. They were professional, but they fed off their principal's energy, and Wheeler's growing anger was affecting the entire group. "Sir, if I may suggest, the waiting area has been specially prepared with refreshments and communication equipment so you can continue your work while—" "I don't want refreshments," Wheeler interrupted sharply. "I want to see the king now. Can't you just go get him?" "I'm afraid that's not how it works, sir. King Edmund is in a secure meeting that cannot be interrupted except in cases of extreme emergency." Wheeler's face was turning red now. Several of his security agents moved closer, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. Captain Rothwell noticed this, but didn't react. He had faced far more dangerous situations than an angry politician. "Everything's an emergency these days," Wheeler muttered loudly enough for the nearby reporters to hear. "First North Korea, then China, now some local dispute that apparently can't wait an hour." Patricia Vance touched Wheeler's arm gently. "Perhaps we should use this time productively. There are several calls you need to make anyway." But Wheeler was beyond reason now. The combination of jet lag, political pressure, and what he perceived as deliberate disrespect had pushed him past his breaking point. "You know what?" Wheeler announced, pointing at Captain Rothwell. "I'm done with this diplomatic nonsense. My security team can escort me directly to wherever the king is meeting. We'll sort this out face to face." Captain Rothwell's expression didn't change, but internally he sighed. He had dealt with difficult dignitaries before, but Wheeler was proving to be particularly challenging. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's not possible. The king's security meeting is classified, and the location is restricted. Even I don't have access to that area during such sessions." Wheeler stepped closer to Captain Rothwell, invading his personal space in what was clearly meant to be an intimidation tactic. "Listen, guard, I don't think you understand. I'm not just any visitor. I'm the president of the United Federation. We're allies. We provide military support, economic aid, and diplomatic cover for this country. When I want to see King Edmund, I see King Edmund." "I understand your position, Mr. President," Captain Rothwell replied evenly. "However, my oath is to protect the security and dignity of this palace and everyone in it, regardless of their rank or nationality. That includes respecting the king's schedule and security protocols." Wheeler's eyes narrowed. "Your oath? What about your country's oath to maintain good relations with its allies?" "My personal oath transcends political considerations, sir. I'm sure you can appreciate the importance of that." The tension in the courtyard was becoming palpable. Reporters were starting to film the exchange, though they were too far away to hear the specific words being spoken. Wheeler's security team was exchanging glances, unsure whether they should intervene. Patricia Vance tried again to calm the situation. "Mr. President, perhaps if we could just wait in the prepared area, we could use this time to review the trade proposals one more time." Wheeler ignored her completely. He was fixated now on what he perceived as defiance from someone he considered far beneath his station. "Guard," Wheeler said, his voice taking on a more threatening tone, "I'm going to give you one more chance to reconsider your position. Either you find a way to get me to King Edmund right now, or I'm going to have my security team escort you away from this entrance and find someone more reasonable to talk to." Captain Rothwell met Wheeler's gaze directly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, sir. I have my orders, and I intend to follow them." Wheeler turned to the head of his security detail, Agent Marcus Stone. Stone was a former Marine, built like a tank and utterly loyal to Wheeler. He had handled numerous situations where the president needed problems to disappear quickly and quietly. "Stone," Wheeler said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I want this guard removed from his position immediately. He's interfering with official United Federation business." Agent Stone looked uncomfortable. This wasn't a normal situation, and he wasn't sure about the legalities of removing a foreign guard from his own post, especially in front of international media. "Sir," Stone said quietly, "perhaps we should consider—" "I didn't ask for your opinion," Wheeler snapped. "I gave you an order. Remove this guard from the entrance so we can proceed with our business." Captain Rothwell watched this exchange with growing concern. The situation was escalating beyond anything he had experienced before. He knew that Wheeler's security team was heavily armed and probably had diplomatic immunity for most of their actions. But he also knew that his oath meant something, and backing down now would set a precedent that could undermine everything the Royal Guard stood for. Agent Stone stepped toward Captain Rothwell, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Captain Rothwell didn't move. "I cannot do that, Agent Stone. This is my post, and I have been given specific instructions by my commanding officer and ultimately by King Edmund himself." "Then I'll have to move you myself," Stone said, reaching out to grab Captain Rothwell's arm. What happened next surprised everyone. Captain Rothwell, moving with the fluid grace of someone trained in multiple forms of combat, simply stepped aside and used Stone's momentum against him, causing the larger man to stumble slightly. It wasn't an attack, merely a defensive maneuver, but it demonstrated that the captain was not going to be easily intimidated or moved. Wheeler was furious now. "Did you see that? He just assaulted a federal agent." "No, sir," Captain Rothwell said calmly. "I simply avoided being grabbed. I have not initiated any aggressive action." The crowd of reporters was growing larger, and several were now openly filming the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of scene that Wheeler usually tried to avoid, but his anger had overcome his political instincts. Patricia Vance was frantically trying to signal to Wheeler to calm down, but he was beyond her influence at this point. The president's pride had been challenged, and he was not the type of man to back down from a fight, regardless of the consequences. "I want this man arrested," Wheeler declared to Agent Stone. "Interfering with a federal official, assault, whatever charges you can think of." "Sir," Agent Stone replied carefully, "we don't have jurisdiction here. This is foreign soil, and he's a member of their military." Wheeler's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Then, get the local police. Get someone with jurisdiction. I'm not leaving here until this guard learns some respect." Captain Rothwell realized that the situation had moved beyond a simple diplomatic delay. Wheeler was now challenging the sovereignty of Valdonia itself, and that was something that could not be allowed to stand. "Mr. President," Captain Rothwell said, his voice carrying a note of steel that hadn't been there before, "I'm going to ask you to step back and allow cooler heads to prevail. This situation is becoming inappropriate for everyone involved." Wheeler stepped even closer to the captain, his face now inches away from the guards. "Inappropriate? You want to see inappropriate? I'm the president of the most powerful nation on earth, and some toy soldier in a fancy uniform thinks he can tell me what to do." The insult hit its mark. Captain Rothwell had served his country with honor for 15 years. He had risked his life countless times, had been wounded in service, and had dedicated his entire adult life to the principles his uniform represented. Being called a toy soldier by someone who had never served a day in military service was more than just an insult. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of everything he stood for. Captain Rothwell's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Those who knew him well would have recognized the sign, but Wheeler was too angry and too arrogant to notice the change. "Sir," Captain Rothwell said, his voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "I am going to ask you one final time to step back and wait for King Edmund in the designated area. What happens next depends entirely on your response." Wheeler laughed, but it was not a pleasant sound. "Are you threatening me? Do you have any idea what I could do to you, to your career, to this entire country? One phone call from me could cut off aid, military support, trade agreements. I could make your little kingdom irrelevant." It was at this moment that Captain Rothwell realized he was not dealing with a reasonable person having a bad day. He was dealing with someone who fundamentally believed that power gave him the right to treat anyone as he pleased, regardless of law, tradition, or basic human dignity. The captain straightened to his full height, his ceremonial sword catching the morning light. When he spoke, his voice carried across the courtyard with absolute clarity, reaching not just Wheeler and his entourage, but also the gathered reporters and their cameras. And in that moment, with those 3 simple words, everything changed. "Not today, sir." The 3 words hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Simple, clear, and absolutely final. Captain James Rothwell had not raised his voice, had not moved aggressively, had not drawn his weapon. He had simply stated a fact that would change the course of international relations forever. President Marcus Wheeler stood frozen for a moment, as if his brain couldn't process what had just happened. No one told him no. No one had told him no in years. Presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, generals, they all found ways to give him what he wanted, even when they disagreed with him. But this guard, this toy soldier in his ceremonial uniform, had just rejected him with a calm finality that was more insulting than any shouted argument could have been. The silence stretched across the courtyard of the Palace of Nations. Reporters held their breath, their cameras focused on the two men facing each other. Wheeler's security team watched nervously, unsure whether they were about to witness a diplomatic incident or something much worse. Patricia Vance, Wheeler's chief of staff, felt her stomach drop. She had seen her boss angry before, but this was different. This was the cold fury that came before Wheeler destroyed someone's life completely and without mercy. She had watched him ruin business partners, political rivals, and anyone else who dared to cross him. But this was foreign soil, and the rules were different here. Wheeler's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and dangerous. "What did you say to me?" Captain Rothwell met his gaze without flinching. "I said not today, sir. You will not be removing me from my post. You will not be bypassing security protocols. You will not be threatening the sovereignty of Valdonia. Not today." The captain's words were measured and professional, but there was steel underneath them that Wheeler had never encountered before. This wasn't the carefully calculated defiance of a political opponent or the nervous resistance of a business rival. This was the absolute certainty of someone who would rather die than compromise his principles. Wheeler's face had gone from red to a pale shade of white. His hands were shaking slightly, though whether from rage or shock was unclear. Agent Stone moved closer to his principal, recognizing the signs of an approaching explosion. "Do you know what you've just done?" Wheeler asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent courtyard. "Do you have any concept of the consequences of what you've just said to me?" "I have a very clear understanding of the consequences, Mr. President," Captain Rothwell replied. "I also have a very clear understanding of my duty." Wheeler turned to Agent Stone. "I want him arrested. Now. I don't care what laws exist here. I don't care about diplomatic protocols. I don't care about anything except seeing this man in handcuffs." Agent Stone shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, as I mentioned before, we don't have jurisdiction. Then, make jurisdiction." Wheeler exploded, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "Call the State Department, call the Defense Department, call whoever you need to call. But I want this problem solved immediately." The outburst drew more attention from the growing crowd of media personnel. News vans were arriving, and satellite trucks were setting up for live broadcasts. What had started as routine coverage of a diplomatic meeting was turning into international breaking news. Captain Rothwell watched Wheeler's meltdown with professional detachment. He had seen powerful people lose control before, though rarely in such a public forum. What struck him most was how quickly Wheeler had abandoned any pretense of dignity or statesmanship when his will was challenged. Patricia Vance stepped forward, trying to salvage what was left of the situation. "Captain Rothwell, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. President Wheeler is naturally concerned about the delay, given the importance of today's discussions. Surely we can find a reasonable accommodation that satisfies everyone's needs." Captain Rothwell turned his attention to her, appreciating her more diplomatic approach. "Ms. Vance, I understand the President's concerns. However, the accommodation has already been made. There is a comfortable waiting area prepared specifically for your delegation, with secure communications and refreshments. The delay is unavoidable due to legitimate security concerns that take precedence over any individual's schedule, regardless of their position." Wheeler stepped between them, his face once again inches from Captain Rothwell's. "I'm not going to any waiting area. I'm not going to be managed like some junior staffer. Either you move, or I'll have you moved." "And how exactly do you propose to do that, Mr. President?" Captain Rothwell asked quietly. The question caught Wheeler off guard. He was accustomed to his threats being taken seriously, to people immediately beginning to calculate how to minimize the damage he could cause them. But Captain Rothwell seemed genuinely curious about the mechanics of Wheeler's threat, as if it were an interesting academic question. "I'll tell you exactly how," Wheeler said, pulling out his phone. "First, I'm calling the Prime Minister of the United Federation. Then, I'm calling the Secretary of Defense. Then, I'm calling every news outlet that matters. By the time I'm done, your little country won't be able to buy a pencil without my approval." Captain Rothwell nodded thoughtfully. "That's certainly one approach, sir. However, you might want to consider a few factors before making those calls." Wheeler paused, his phone halfway to his ear. Something in the captain's tone suggested that he wasn't as powerless as Wheeler had assumed. "First," Captain Rothwell continued conversationally, "you're currently standing on sovereign Valdonian soil, making threats against a member of our military while being recorded by international media. That footage is probably already being broadcast live around the world. Wheeler glanced around and realized that the captain was correct. There were at least a dozen cameras pointed at them, and several reporters were speaking rapidly into their microphones, no doubt describing the confrontation to their audiences. Second, the captain continued, King Edmund's emergency meeting? It's with the defense ministers of 12 allied nations, discussing unified responses to international aggression. Your behavior here is likely being described to them in real time by the king's security staff. Wheeler's confidence wavered slightly, but his anger was still driving him forward. I don't care who's watching. I don't care who's listening. I want results, not excuses. Third, Captain Rothwell said, his voice taking on a harder edge, and, most importantly, you seem to be operating under the assumption that threats and intimidation will work on me. Let me clarify something for you, Mr. President. I have been shot at by terrorists, stabbed by assassins, and threatened by dictators. I have faced down armed mobs and suicide bombers. Your threats to cut foreign aid do not frighten me. The captain paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. I swore an oath to protect the dignity and security of this palace and everyone in it. That oath was not conditional on the political convenience of the moment. It was not subject to economic considerations. It was absolute, and I will honor it, regardless of the consequences. Wheeler was staring at him now with something approaching genuine shock. In his world, everyone had a price, everyone had pressure points, everyone could be influenced or controlled. But Captain Rothwell was speaking like someone who had already calculated the cost of his defiance and decided it was worth paying. Agent Stone leaned close to Wheeler and whispered urgently in his ear. Whatever he said seemed to give Wheeler pause. The president looked around again, taking in the cameras, the growing crowd, and the increasingly hostile expressions of the Valdonian palace guards who had taken positions throughout the courtyard. Patricia Vance seized the moment of hesitation. Mr. President, perhaps we should reassess the situation. The optics here are becoming quite challenging. But Wheeler's pride was still in control. The idea that some foreign guard could publicly humiliate him and get away with it was unbearable. His entire political brand was built on the image of strength and dominance. Backing down now would destroy that image completely. I'll tell you what the optics are, Wheeler declared loudly, clearly intending for the reporters to hear him. The optics are that America's allies think they can disrespect us without consequences. The optics are that some countries have forgotten who provides their security and prosperity. Captain Rothwell's expression darkened at the implication. Mr. President, with all due respect, Valdonia's relationship with the United Federation is one of mutual benefit, not dependence. We provide you with strategic bases, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic support. In return, you provide certain military and economic partnerships. Neither country is doing the other a favor. Wheeler's phone was still in his hand, and Patricia Vance could see him calculating whether to make good on his threats. She also knew that once those calls were made, there would be no backing down, no diplomatic solution, and potentially no way to avoid a complete breakdown in relations between the two countries. Sir, she said quietly, perhaps we should consider the broader implications. The only implication I care about, Wheeler interrupted, is that people need to learn their place in the world order. Captain Rothwell straightened slightly at the phrase their place. It was exactly the kind of language that revealed Wheeler's true feelings about anyone he considered beneath him, which apparently included entire nations and their representatives. I see, the captain said slowly. And what, in your opinion, is my place in this world order? Wheeler smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, but it was not a pleasant expression. Your place is to step aside when your betters tell you to step aside. Your place is to understand that some people matter more than others. Your place is to recognize that reality has a hierarchy, and you're not at the top of it. The words hit their target perfectly. Captain Rothwell had dedicated his life to the principle that all people had dignity regardless of their birth, wealth, or power. The idea that some people were inherently better than others was antithetical to everything he believed in and everything his country stood for. I see, Captain Rothwell repeated, his voice now carrying a note of genuine anger for the first time. So in your world, Mr. President, some people matter more than others based on their wealth and position. That's exactly right, Wheeler confirmed, apparently pleased that the captain was finally understanding. The sooner everyone accepts that reality, the smoother things will go for everyone. Captain Rothwell nodded slowly, as if processing this worldview. And those of us lower in your hierarchy should simply accept whatever treatment we receive from our betters. Now you're getting it, Wheeler said condescendingly. Captain Rothwell was quiet for a long moment, looking past Wheeler at the gathered reporters, the palace staff, and the tourists who had stopped to watch the confrontation. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the courtyard with absolute clarity. "Mr. President," he said, "I have served my country for 15 years. I have protected visitors from over 100 nations, including multiple American presidents who understood the dignity of their office and the respect due to their hosts. I have never, in all those years, encountered someone who so fundamentally misunderstood what leadership actually means." Wheeler's smile faded as he realized the captain wasn't capitulating. "Leadership," Captain Rothwell continued, "is not about proving you can push people around. It's not about demonstrating that you have more power than someone else. Leadership is about using whatever authority you have been given to protect and serve others, especially those who cannot protect themselves." The captain's voice was rising now, not in anger but in passion for principles he had spent his adult life defending. A true leader would understand that being kept waiting for 30 minutes due to a legitimate security concern is a minor inconvenience, not a personal insult. A true leader would respect the customs and sovereignty of allied nations. A true leader would recognize that the guard standing at his post is doing exactly what leaders are supposed to do, honoring his commitments regardless of the personal cost. Wheeler's face was turning red again, but this time it seemed more from embarrassment than anger. The captain's words were carrying clearly to the reporters, and Wheeler could see them scribbling notes frantically. And, most importantly, Captain Rothwell concluded, a true leader would never, under any circumstances, use his position to try to humiliate someone who cannot fight back on equal terms. That's not leadership, Mr. President. That's bullying. The silence that followed was deafening. Wheeler stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at a man who had just delivered a devastating critique of his entire worldview in front of international media. Agent Stone was looking around nervously, trying to assess whether the situation had moved from diplomatic incident to security threat. Patricia Vance closed her eyes, knowing that whatever political capital the United Federation had built up with Valdonia over the past decade had just evaporated in the space of a 5-minute conversation. And Captain James Rothwell stood at his post, unwavering as ever, waiting to see what the most powerful man in the world would do when someone finally told him the truth about himself. President Marcus Wheeler stared at Captain James Rothwell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. The courtyard of the Palace of Nations had fallen completely silent except for the distant hum of news helicopter blades and the soft clicking of camera shutters. Wheeler's mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened to him. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not business partners, not political rivals, not even his ex-wives during their most bitter divorce proceedings. Captain Rothwell had just delivered a devastating assessment of Wheeler's character with the calm precision of a surgeon, and he had done it in front of the International Press Corps. Wheeler looked around at the faces surrounding him. His own security team looked uncomfortable and uncertain. Patricia Vance was pale and appeared to be calculating damage control strategies. The Valdonian Palace guards who had moved into position throughout the courtyard were watching with professional interest but clear disapproval of his behavior. Most troubling of all were the reporters. Wheeler had built his career on managing media narratives, on controlling how stories were told. But this was different. This wasn't a press conference where he could choose the questions or a controlled interview where he could redirect uncomfortable topics. This was raw, unfiltered confrontation being broadcast live around the world. Wheeler's phone buzzed with incoming calls and text messages. His staff back home in the United Federation had obviously seen the news coverage and were trying to reach him for instructions. The president's communications director, the Secretary of State, congressional leaders, and foreign policy advisors were all probably watching this disaster unfold in real time. Agent Stone leaned close to Wheeler and spoke quietly. "Sir, we should probably consider moving this conversation to a more private setting." Wheeler ignored him. His focus was entirely on Captain Rothwell, who continued to stand at his post with the same professional composure he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. The captain wasn't gloating or showing any satisfaction at having delivered such a pointed critique. He was simply doing his job, which somehow made his words even more damaging. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" Wheeler finally said, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage. "I think I'm a soldier doing my duty, sir," Captain Rothwell replied evenly. "Your duty," Wheeler repeated mockingly. "Right. Your duty to lecture visiting heads of state about leadership. My duty to maintain the security and dignity of this palace, sir. That includes not allowing anyone to compromise either through inappropriate behavior. Wheeler stepped back slightly, and, for a moment, Patricia Vance thought he might be ready to end the confrontation. But she could see the calculation in his eyes, the same look he got when he was planning a particularly vicious business deal. Captain Rothwell, Wheeler said, his voice taking on a false, reasonable tone, you've made your point. You're a man of principle, and I can respect that. But let's talk about practical realities here. Captain Rothwell said nothing, waiting to hear where this was going. Wheeler began to pace slightly, his hands clasped behind his back in what was probably meant to look statesmanlike, but came across as predatory. You talk about leadership and duty and all these noble concepts. But at the end of the day, countries need practical relationships, not philosophical purity. The president gestured toward the palace behind them. This beautiful building, these ceremonial guards, this whole kingdom, it all exists because of practical realities. Economic relationships, military partnerships, diplomatic cooperation. And those relationships require flexibility from both sides. Captain Rothwell listened without changing expression, but Patricia Vance could see that Wheeler was walking into another trap. The president was so angry that he couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else, that every word he spoke was making the situation worse. Now, Wheeler continued, I'm willing to overlook your passionate defense of protocol. We can call it a cultural misunderstanding. But, going forward, I think we need to establish some clearer boundaries about how these interactions should work. What sort of boundaries, Mr. President? Captain Rothwell asked. Wheeler smiled, apparently believing he had regained control of the conversation. Well, for instance, when the President of the United Federation requests access to speak with King Edmund, even during a security meeting, arrangements should be made to accommodate that request promptly. I see. And if such arrangements would compromise security protocols, then the security protocols need to be adjusted to reflect political realities. Captain Rothwell nodded slowly, as if considering this perspective. So you're suggesting that security decisions should be based on the political importance of the person making the request? Exactly, Wheeler said, pleased that the captain was finally understanding. Some requests carry more weight than others. It's just logical. And who decides how much weight each request carries? Wheeler's smile became wider and more condescending. Well, that should be obvious. The President of the United Federation carries more weight than, say, the foreign minister of some small African nation. The economic and military leader of the free world carries more weight than a ceremonial monarch. The implications of Wheeler's words hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. He was essentially arguing that King Edmund of Valdonia, in his own palace, should defer to Wheeler's convenience. More than that, he was suggesting that the entire international system should be restructured around American preferences. Captain Rothwell was quiet for a long moment, and Patricia Vance found herself hoping against hope that he would let the comment pass without further escalation. Mr. President, Captain Rothwell finally said, are you suggesting that Valdonian security protocols should be subordinated to American political preferences? Wheeler, apparently oblivious to the dangerous ground he was walking on, nodded enthusiastically. Now you're thinking strategically. Look, I understand you have your traditions and your procedures, but we live in a modern world with modern requirements. Flexibility is essential. Flexibility, Captain Rothwell repeated. Right. Your king understands this, which is why Valdonia has been such a strong partner for us. He knows that sometimes you have to bend a little to maintain the bigger relationship. Captain Rothwell's expression was becoming harder to read, which Patricia Vance recognized as a very bad sign. People who maintained perfect composure while being insulted were usually planning something. Let me make sure I understand your position correctly, Captain Rothwell said carefully. You believe that Valdonia's security protocols should be modified based on your convenience. You believe that King Edmund should interrupt classified security meetings to accommodate your schedule. And you believe that this palace's procedures should be restructured to reflect what you call political realities. Finally, Wheeler exclaimed, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not personal, it's just practical politics. Captain Rothwell looked around the courtyard, his gaze taking in the reporters, the tourists, the palace staff, and his fellow guards. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of profound sadness. Mr. President, what you're describing is not politics. It's imperialism. The word hit the crowd like lightning. Reporters straightened up, recognizing that the story had just taken on much larger implications. Palace staff exchanged glances, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. Wheeler's face flushed again. That's ridiculous. I'm talking about normal diplomatic cooperation between allies. No, sir, Captain Rothwell said firmly. You're talking about one country dictating terms to another based solely on superior power. You're talking about sovereignty as a conditional privilege that can be revoked when inconvenient. That's not alliance, Mr. President. That's dominance. Wheeler was beginning to realize that he had walked into a much more serious conversation than he intended. But his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Call it whatever you want, he said defiantly. The reality is that power creates responsibilities and privileges. The United Federation has global responsibilities that require special consideration. And Valdonia's responsibility is to accommodate those requirements regardless of our own interests or principles. If you want to maintain a productive relationship, yes. Captain Rothwell was quiet again, but this time his silence had a different quality. He was no longer listening to understand Wheeler's position. He was listening to ensure that he had heard it correctly before responding. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the courtyard with unmistakable authority. Mr. President, I need to inform you that this conversation has moved beyond a simple scheduling dispute. You are now questioning the fundamental sovereignty of Valdonia, suggesting that our security procedures should be subordinated to your convenience, and implying that our independence is conditional on American approval. Wheeler opened his mouth to object, but Captain Rothwell continued without pausing. These statements, made in public, in front of international media, on Valdonian soil, constitute what can only be described as a direct challenge to our national dignity. They cannot be overlooked or explained away as cultural misunderstandings. Patricia Vance felt her heart sink. She could see the train wreck coming, but there was no way to stop it now. Wheeler had pushed the situation far beyond anything that could be managed with normal diplomatic channels. Furthermore, Captain Rothwell continued, your demand that I be removed from my post for following security protocols, your threats to use American economic and military power to punish Valdonia for maintaining our sovereignty, and your explicit statement that some people matter more than others based on their nationality and position all constitute serious diplomatic violations. Wheeler finally understood that he had walked into a minefield. But instead of carefully backing away, his instinct was to double down and fight his way out. Are you threatening me? He demanded. I am informing you, sir, that your behavior today will have consequences far beyond this courtyard. These statements are being recorded and broadcast around the world. They will be analyzed by foreign policy experts, discussed in international forums, and remembered by allied nations who are now questioning whether the United Federation views them as partners or subjects. Captain Rothwell paused, giving Wheeler one final opportunity to salvage something from the disaster. I am also informing you that King Edmund's security meeting has concluded, and he is now available to meet with you. However, given the nature of our conversation today, I suspect that meeting will be quite different from what either of you originally intended. Wheeler looked around the courtyard one more time, finally, beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. The reporters were no longer just covering a minor diplomatic delay. They were documenting what might be a fundamental shift in international relationships. Agent Stone stepped forward again. Sir, perhaps we should— No, Wheeler interrupted, his voice shaking with rage and something that might have been fear. We're not done here. This guard thinks he can lecture the President of the United States about international relations. I want to see what kind of backing he has when the chips are really down. Captain Rothwell met Wheeler's gaze one final time. Mr. President, the backing I have is the knowledge that I did my duty, honored my oath, and stood up for principles that are more important than any individual's wounded pride. That backing has sustained better men than either of us through much worse situations than this. Wheeler pulled out his phone. We'll see about that. And, with those words, President Marcus Wheeler began making the phone calls that would transform a minor diplomatic incident into an international crisis that would reshape the global balance of power. President Marcus Wheeler's first call was to his chief of staff back in the capital of the United Federation. Robert Kellerman had been Wheeler's political fixer for over a decade, and he was accustomed to cleaning up messes that would have destroyed lesser politicians. But when Wheeler's angry voice came through his secure phone line, describing the confrontation with Captain Rothwell, even Kellerman knew this was different. Are you telling me, Kellerman said slowly, that you publicly questioned Valdonia's sovereignty in front of international media because a guard asked you to wait 30 minutes? I'm telling you that some foreign soldier thinks he can disrespect the President of the United States. Wheeler snapped, his voice carrying clearly across the still silent courtyard. He had made no effort to move to a more private location for his calls, apparently wanting Captain Rothwell and everyone else to hear him mobilizing his resources. Marcus, Kellerman said, using the president's first name in a way that indicated extreme concern. Please tell me you're calling from a secure location where the press can't hear you. Wheeler looked around at the dozens of reporters and camera crews surrounding him. The press can hear whatever I want them to hear, Bob. I want the whole world to understand that there are consequences for disrespecting America. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Kellerman spoke again, his voice had taken on the carefully neutral tone he used when delivering very bad news. Sir, I'm looking at the live feeds right now. Every major news network is carrying this story. The footage of your confrontation with the guard is already the top trending topic on social media worldwide. The preliminary reaction from international observers is not positive. Wheeler's face darkened further. I don't care about preliminary reactions. I care about results. I want you to start making calls. Defense Department, State Department, Treasury. I want Valdonia to understand that actions have consequences. Captain Rothwell, who was standing close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, maintained his professional composure, but Patricia Vance could see him taking mental notes of everything Wheeler was saying. Kellerman's voice came through the phone with obvious strain. Mr. President, before we take any action, perhaps we should consider— I don't want considerations, Wheeler interrupted. I want that guard fired. I want a public apology from King Edmund, and I want assurances that American officials will never again be subjected to this kind of treatment. Sir, you're asking a sovereign nation to fire a member of their military for doing his job. The optics are that America stands up for itself. Wheeler shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. The optics are that we don't let two-bit kingdoms push us around. Captain Rothwell's expression didn't change, but several of his fellow guards who had positioned themselves around the courtyard shifted slightly. The phrase, two-bit kingdom, was particularly insulting, given that Valdonia was one of the oldest continuous monarchies in Europe and had been an American ally for over a century. Patricia Vance tried one more time to salvage the situation. Mr. President, perhaps if we could just accept King Edmund's apology for the delay and move forward with the scheduled meeting. There is no meeting, Wheeler declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not until this situation is resolved to my satisfaction. The statement sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Wheeler was essentially saying that he would rather cancel crucial diplomatic talks than admit he had overreacted to a minor delay. Captain Rothwell spoke for the first time since Wheeler had begun his phone calls. Mr. President, are you saying that you're willing to damage relations between our countries because I asked you to wait 30 minutes? Wheeler spun around to face him. I'm saying that respect is non-negotiable. Either people respect the office of the President of the United States, or they face the consequences. And what consequences might those be, sir? The question was asked innocently enough, but Wheeler took it as a challenge. He held up his phone. Would you like me to show you? Bob, are you still there? Yes, sir, came Kellerman's worried voice. I want you to call Secretary Morrison at Defense. Tell him to review all military cooperation agreements with Valdonia. I want to know exactly what we provide them and how quickly we can cut it off. There was dead silence in the courtyard. Even the reporters seemed stunned by the rapid escalation from a personal dispute to threatened military consequences. Captain Rothwell's voice remained steady. Mr. President, are you threatening to end military cooperation between our countries because I maintain security protocols? I'm not threatening anything, Wheeler said with false calm. I'm simply reviewing our relationships to ensure they're mutually beneficial. Kellerman's voice came through the phone again, obviously distressed. Sir, I have to advise against any hasty actions regarding military cooperation. Valdonia hosts 3 of our most strategically important bases in Europe. The intelligence sharing agreements alone. Are you telling me how to do my job, Bob? Wheeler interrupted dangerously. No, sir. I'm providing information so you can make informed decisions. Wheeler looked directly at Captain Rothwell as he spoke into the phone. Here's the only information I need. Either that guard apologizes publicly for his disrespectful behavior, or we start reviewing every single aspect of our relationship with this country. Captain Rothwell met Wheeler's gaze without flinching. Mr. President, I cannot apologize for doing my job. More importantly, I will not apologize for defending my country's sovereignty. Wheeler's smile was cold and predatory. Your country's sovereignty exists because we allow it to exist. Don't forget that. The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Several of the Valdonian guards visibly stiffened, and Patricia Vance actually took a step backward, as if trying to distance herself from what Wheeler had just said. Captain Rothwell was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of profound sadness mixed with steel. Mr. President, with those words, you have just revealed the true nature of how you view international relationships. You don't see allies, you see vassals. You don't see partnership, you see dominance. Wheeler was too angry to realize he had just made a catastrophic error. I see reality. And the reality is that power has its privileges. And its responsibilities, Captain Rothwell replied, which you seem to have forgotten. At that moment, a commotion near the palace entrance drew everyone's attention. King Edmund himself was approaching, flanked by his security detail and what appeared to be several foreign officials. The emergency meeting had indeed concluded, and the king had obviously been informed about the confrontation taking place in his courtyard. King Edmund of Valdonia was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had been born to leadership, but had earned the right to it through decades of service. He walked with the confidence of someone who had faced down much more serious threats than an angry American president. Wheeler straightened up, apparently believing that the king's arrival meant he would finally get the respect and deference he felt he deserved. But King Edmund's expression was not that of someone preparing to offer apologies. President Wheeler, the king said as he approached, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. I understand there has been some confusion about protocol. Wheeler stepped forward eagerly. Your Majesty, thank you for finally making time in your schedule. I was just explaining to your guard here that certain accommodations need to be made for, actually. King Edmund interrupted calmly. I was referring to your confusion about protocol, not ours. Wheeler stopped mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open. King Edmund continued without pause. You see, President Wheeler, in Valdonia we have certain traditions regarding how guests behave in our home. These traditions are based on mutual respect, diplomatic courtesy, and recognition of sovereignty. I'm told that you have some difficulty understanding these concepts. The king's words were delivered with perfect diplomatic courtesy, but there was no mistaking their meaning. Wheeler was being politely but firmly put in his place by someone who outranked him in the most fundamental way possible. This was King Edmund's country, and Wheeler was merely a visitor. Furthermore, King Edmund said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, I have been informed that you have made certain statements regarding Valdonia's sovereignty that require immediate clarification. Wheeler looked around desperately, realizing that the situation had completely escaped his control. The king was not intimidated by American power, was not impressed by Wheeler's bluster, and was clearly prepared to defend his country's dignity regardless of the consequences. Your Majesty, Patricia Vance interjected desperately. I'm sure there has been a misunderstanding. President Wheeler was simply expressing frustration about the delay, Ms. Vance, King Edmund said politely but firmly, I have watched the live coverage of this confrontation. There has been no misunderstanding. President Wheeler has made his position quite clear. The king turned his attention back to Wheeler. You have stated that Valdonia's sovereignty exists because America allows it to exist. You have demanded that our security protocols be modified to suit your convenience. You have threatened to end military cooperation because one of my guards did his job. These are not the words or actions of an ally, Mr. President. They are the words and actions of someone who views partnership as submission. Wheeler's face was red again, but this time it seemed more from embarrassment than anger. He was facing someone who was his equal in authority and vastly his superior in diplomacy, and the contrast was becoming obvious to everyone present. Your Majesty, Wheeler said, trying to regain some semblance of control, I think we need to discuss this matter privately, without all these cameras and reporters. King Edmund smiled politely. Oh, I think this conversation is proceeding exactly as it should, Mr. President. After all, you made your position quite public. It seems only fair that our response should be equally public. Wheeler looked around the courtyard one more time, finally, beginning to understand that he had not just picked a fight with Captain Rothwell. He had picked a fight with an entire nation, in front of the entire world, and he was losing badly. But his pride still wouldn't let him back down. Instead of cutting his losses and trying to salvage what was left of the relationship, Wheeler decided to double down one final time. Fine, he said, his voice shaking with rage. Let's make this as public as you want. Bob, are you still on the line? Yes, sir, came Kellerman's increasingly desperate voice. I want you to call an emergency session of Congress. I want sanctions prepared against Valdonia for hostile treatment of American officials. And I want our allies to understand that this is what happens when you disrespect the United States." The courtyard fell completely silent. Wheeler had just escalated a personal dispute into a full international crisis, threatening economic warfare against an ally because a guard had asked him to wait. King Edmund looked at Wheeler with what could only be described as pity. "Mr. President, I sincerely hope you reconsider those statements. Because if you follow through on those threats, you will discover that Valdonia is not as isolated or powerless as you seem to believe." Wheeler laughed, but it was a harsh, angry sound. "Are you threatening me now, too?" King Edmund's expression became very serious. "Mr. President, I am informing you that those 12 defense ministers I was meeting with when you arrived, they have been listening to this entire conversation through my security feed, and they are very interested in discussing alternative arrangements for European security cooperation." Wheeler's laughter died in his throat as the implications hit him. The emergency meeting hadn't been about some distant crisis. It had been about American actions in the Eastern Territories, and King Edmund had just given 12 Allied defense ministers front-row seats to Wheeler's complete diplomatic meltdown. Captain Rothwell, who had stood silently through the entire exchange between Wheeler and the king, finally spoke one last time. "Mr. President," he said quietly, "perhaps now you understand why I said not today, sir. Some things are more important than any individual's convenience, even yours." And in that moment, President Marcus Wheeler realized that 3 simple words from a royal guard had just changed the course of international relations forever. The aftermath of President Marcus Wheeler's confrontation with Captain James Rothwell unfolded like dominoes falling across the global political landscape. Within hours of the initial incident, what had started as a minor diplomatic delay had transformed into the most significant international crisis of Wheeler's presidency. The first domino fell before Wheeler even left Valdonian soil. As his motorcade departed the Palace of Nations without the scheduled meeting taking place, his secure phone was buzzing constantly with incoming calls from world leaders, congressional representatives, and military officials. Each conversation brought worse news than the last. Robert Kellerman, Wheeler's chief of staff, delivered the initial damage assessment during the flight back to the United Federation capital. His voice was hoarse from hours of crisis management calls, and his usual political optimism had been replaced by grim professionalism. "The Senate Majority Leader wants an emergency briefing on why you're threatening sanctions against one of our closest allies," Kellerman reported as Wheeler sat in his private cabin aboard Air Force One. "The Secretary of Defense is requesting clarification on whether you actually want to review military cooperation agreements. And the Secretary of State has submitted her resignation." Wheeler looked up sharply. "Linda resigned?" "What?" she said, and I quote, "I cannot serve an administration that treats allies as enemies and sovereignty as a privilege to be granted or revoked at American discretion." Patricia Vance, who had been unusually quiet during the flight, finally spoke up. "Sir, we need to discuss the international response. It's significant." Wheeler waved dismissively. "Let me guess. A bunch of foreign ministers expressing concern and calling for calm dialogue. The usual diplomatic noise." "No, sir," Vance said carefully. "It's much more serious than that. The European Defense Alliance has called an emergency session. The Pacific Security Council is reviewing American base agreements. And, most importantly, the Global Economic Forum has suspended the United Federation's membership pending review of our commitment to international law." Wheeler's face darkened. The Global Economic Forum controlled much of the world's trade relationships, and suspension from it would have immediate and devastating effects on the American economy. "They can't do that," Wheeler said flatly. "We're the largest economy in the world. They need us more than we need them." Kellerman and Vance exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten them into this crisis in the first place. "Sir," Kellerman said gently, "that may have been true 20 years ago. But economic power has become much more distributed. The European Union, the Asian Trade Partnership, and the African Economic Alliance combined actually represent a larger market than we do." Wheeler stared out the window of the aircraft, watching clouds pass by as he tried to process how quickly his world had changed. Just 12 hours ago, he had been the most powerful man on Earth, confident in America's dominance and his own ability to bend others to his will. Now he was facing the possibility that his actions had fundamentally altered the global balance of power. Meanwhile, back in Valdonia, Captain James Rothwell was experiencing his own version of aftermath. He had returned to his normal duties after the confrontation, but the palace was buzzing with activity as King Edmund and his advisors worked to coordinate the international response to Wheeler's threats. Captain Rothwell was summoned to King Edmund's private office late that evening. He had met with the king before, but always in formal, ceremonial contexts. This was different. King Edmund was sitting behind his desk in casual clothes, looking tired but determined. "Captain Rothwell," the king said as he entered, "please sit down. I wanted to speak with you privately about today's events." "Your Majesty," Captain Rothwell replied, taking the offered seat. "I hope I didn't exceed my authority in my responses to President Wheeler." King Edmund smiled slightly. "James, you may have just saved European independence. I hardly think you exceeded anything." The king stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the palace courtyard where the confrontation had taken place. "Tell me, what was going through your mind when Wheeler first demanded that you step aside?" Captain Rothwell considered the question carefully. "Honestly, Your Majesty, my first thought was that he was having a bad day and would calm down once he understood the security protocols. I've dealt with frustrated dignitaries before. And when did you realize this was different?" "When he called me a toy soldier and said that some people matter more than others based on their position. That's when I understood that this wasn't about protocol or schedules. It was about fundamental respect for human dignity." King Edmund nodded. "And your decision to stand your ground despite his threats?" Captain Rothwell was quiet for a moment. "Your Majesty, I swore an oath when I joined the Royal Guard. That oath wasn't conditional on the political convenience of the moment. If I had stepped aside because Wheeler threatened economic consequences, what message would that send? That our principles are for sale? That sovereignty is just a word that disappears when someone with more power shows up." The king turned back to face him. "James, I want you to know that your actions today did more than protect protocol. You articulated principles that many world leaders have been afraid to voice. You reminded everyone watching that dignity and sovereignty are not negotiable commodities." Captain Rothwell looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job, Your Majesty." "No," King Edmund said firmly. "You were doing much more than that. And because of your courage, we now have an opportunity to reshape international relationships in a way that promotes mutual respect rather than dominance." The king returned to his desk and pulled out a folder. "The 12 defense ministers who witnessed Wheeler's behavior have spent the afternoon in emergency session. They've proposed a new security framework that reduces dependence on American military infrastructure and creates more balanced partnerships." Captain Rothwell's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, surely they're not considering ending the alliance with the United Federation entirely?" "Not ending it," King Edmund clarified, "but certainly restructuring it. Wheeler's behavior today demonstrated that the current relationship is fundamentally unhealthy. When one partner believes they can threaten and intimidate the others without consequences, it's not really a partnership at all." Back in the United Federation, the political crisis was deepening by the hour. Wheeler had returned to find Congress in an uproar, with both his own party members and the opposition demanding explanations for his actions. Senator Margaret Hayes, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, had called for immediate hearings. "The President of the United States threatened economic warfare against one of our closest allies because a security guard asked him to wait 30 minutes, she declared to a packed press conference. "This is not leadership. This is a diplomatic disaster of unprecedented proportions." The economic markets were responding as well. The Federation dollar was dropping against major currencies as investors worried about the stability of international trade relationships. Several major corporations that depended on global supply chains were seeing their stock prices fall dramatically. Most damaging of all was the social media response. The video of Wheeler's confrontation with Captain Rothwell had been viewed over 1 billion times in the first 24 hours. Comment sections were filled with international observers expressing shock and disappointment at Wheeler's behavior. A particularly viral post from a former British ambassador summed up the international mood. "I've witnessed many diplomatic disputes in my career, but I've never seen a head of state so completely abandon basic courtesy and respect." Captain Rothwell's dignity in the face of such bullying behavior was extraordinary. He reminded us all what real leadership looks like. 3 days after the incident, Wheeler was forced to address the crisis in a nationally televised speech. He had initially wanted to double down on his position, but the economic and political pressure had become impossible to ignore. Standing behind the presidential podium, Wheeler looked older and more uncertain than he had at any point during his presidency. The speech had been carefully crafted by his remaining advisors to minimize damage while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. My fellow Americans, he began, recent events in Valdonia have been mischaracterized by the media and political opponents who seek to undermine American strength abroad. But, even as he spoke the words, Wheeler could see from the faces of his staff that the speech was falling flat. The international audience had seen the unedited footage of his behavior, and no amount of spin could change what they had witnessed. Meanwhile, Captain James Rothwell was back at his post outside the Palace of Nations, maintaining the same professional demeanor he had shown throughout his career. But the world had changed around him. Tourists now came specifically to see the guard who had stood up to the most powerful man on earth. International delegations requested meetings in the same courtyard where the confrontation had taken place. More importantly, the incident had sparked a global conversation about the nature of power, respect, and international relationships. Universities were holding seminars on the Rothwell Doctrine, the idea that dignity and sovereignty could not be compromised regardless of economic or military pressure. 6 months later, the geopolitical landscape looked fundamentally different. The European Defense Alliance had indeed created new security frameworks that reduced dependence on American military bases. The Global Economic Forum had created new trade relationships that bypassed American-dominated systems. Several American allies had begun pursuing more independent foreign policies. Wheeler's presidency never recovered from the crisis. His own party abandoned him during the next election cycle, and he was defeated by the largest margin in modern political history. His challenger's campaign slogan had been simple but effective: respect, not dominance. Captain James Rothwell, for his part, continued serving in the Royal Guard until his retirement 5 years later. He rarely spoke publicly about the incident, maintaining that he had simply done his duty. But his actions on that morning had created ripple effects that continued to shape international relations for generations. The most lasting change was perhaps the most subtle one. In diplomatic circles around the world, a new standard had been established. When powerful individuals attempted to use their position to intimidate or coerce others, they were often met with a simple phrase that had become synonymous with principled resistance. "Not today, sir." The phrase appeared on protest signs, in diplomatic communications, and in countless social media posts whenever someone stood up to abuse of power. It had become shorthand for the idea that some things, dignity, sovereignty, respect for others, were more important than convenience, wealth, or political power. Years later, when diplomatic historians studied the incident, they identified it as a turning point in global relations. The moment when the world moved from a system based on dominance and submission to one based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. And it all started with 3 words from a royal guard who simply refused to step aside when a bully demanded it. Captain James Rothwell had not intended to change the world. He had not planned to become a symbol of resistance to authoritarianism. He had not sought to reshape international relations or challenge the global balance of power. He had simply stood at his post, honored his oath, and remembered that some things are more important than any individual's wounded pride, even if that individual happens to be the most powerful person on earth. In the end, that was enough. Sometimes, the most extraordinary changes begin with the most ordinary courage. A person in uniform doing their job, defending principles they believe in, and refusing to back down when those principles are challenged. "Not today, sir," had become more than just a response to an unreasonable demand. It had become a reminder that power without respect is just bullying, and that true strength comes not from the ability to force others to submit, but from the courage to stand for something greater than yourself, regardless of the consequences. The confrontation between President Marcus Wheeler and Captain James Rothwell lasted less than an hour, but its effects would be felt for decades. It proved that sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is not the one with the most money, the biggest military, or the highest office. Sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is simply the one willing to say no.